Thomas Jenkins shuffled through his mail on a crisp autumn Friday, the kind of day when nothing extraordinary was supposed to happen. Bills, advertisements, a card from his daughter in Seattle. Then he spotted it, a certified letter with the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association logo embossed on the envelope. His fingers trembled slightly as he tore it open, a sense of foreboding washing over him. Dear Mr. Jenkins, the letter began formally. This correspondence serves as official notice that your account with Oak Ridge Estates HOA is severely delinquent in the amount of $47,382.16 for unpaid dues, special assessments, late fees, and compounded interest dating back to April 1997. Thomas collapsed into his armchair, the blood draining from his face. The room seemed to spin around him as he read further. Threat of property laying, legal action, potential foreclosure, all to be initiated within 30 days if payment wasn't received in full. This is insane, he whispered to the empty living room where Martha's photograph still watched over him from the mantel. His late wife had handled most of their finances until her passing 3 years ago, but he knew she'd been meticulous about their obligations. They'd lived in this house for nearly 25 years, raising 2 children beneath its roof. The idea that they'd somehow failed to pay dues for over 2 decades without consequence seemed absurd. The letter was signed by Victoria Harmon, the newly elected HOA president whom Thomas had only seen from afar at community events. Below her signature was that of Jeremy Phelps from Strategic Community Management Solutions, a company that had taken over HOA operations just 6 months earlier. Thomas's hand shook as he reached for his phone. His first instinct was to call his daughter, but he stopped himself. Laura was 7 months pregnant with his first grandchild and didn't need this stress. Instead, he dialed his neighbor and friend of 15 years, Eleanor Michaels. "Ellie," he said when she answered, his voice cracking. "I think I might lose my house." The weekend transformed Thomas's immaculate garage into an archaeological dig site. Cardboard boxes labeled in Martha's neat handwriting lined the concrete floor as Thomas methodically excavated their financial history. His reading glasses perched on the end of his nose, sweat beading on his forehead despite the autumn chill. "Martha, where did you put it all?" he murmured, a habit he developed since her passing, these one-sided conversations that somehow made him feel less alone. Eleanor sat cross-legged on the floor beside him, organizing documents into chronological piles. "Your wife was remarkably organized," she commented, admiration in her voice as she examined a folder of utility payments from 2003, each receipt paper-clipped to its corresponding bill. By Sunday afternoon, they had constructed a timeline spanning back to when Thomas and Martha had purchased the house in 1996. Thomas discovered carbon copies of checks for HOA dues, bank statements showing automatic withdrawals, and even handwritten receipts from the days when payments were made in person at the community clubhouse. "Look at this," Eleanor said suddenly, holding up a yellowed notice. There was a special assessment in 1997, $2,200 per household for repairing the community pool and tennis courts. Thomas took the paper, memories flooding back. "I remember this. Half the neighborhood was up in arms because the board approved it without proper notice. There were heated meetings." He dug further into the box and produced a second notice. "Here it is. They rescinded the assessment after the backlash. But according to your records, they never refunded those who paid promptly," Eleanor observed, examining a receipt showing Thomas and Martha had paid the assessment in full before the reversal. As the sun set, they found a disturbing pattern. During periods when the HOA changed management companies, which had happened 3 times, there were gaps in receipt records. Thomas had bank records showing payments leaving his account, but no corresponding acknowledgement from the HOA. "They're double-dipping," Eleanor said, her voice tight with indignation. "Charging you again for payments that were lost in their administrative chaos." Thomas rubbed his tired eyes. "How do I fight this, Ellie? I'm just one homeowner against their legal team." Eleanor's expression hardened with determination. "My niece Samantha works in real estate law. Let me call her." The Copper Kettle Cafe buzzed with Monday morning energy as Thomas nervously stirred his black coffee. Eleanor had arranged the meeting, but left Thomas to handle it alone, saying, "Samantha will take you more seriously if I'm not there playing the protective auntie." Samantha Rodriguez arrived exactly on time, dressed in a sharp charcoal pantsuit that made Thomas feel underdressed in his casual button-down. At 34, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who regularly battled in professional arenas. She set down her leather portfolio and extended her hand. "Mr. Jenkins, I'm glad you reached out. Aunt Ellie speaks highly of you." Thomas shook her hand, noting her firm grip. "Thank you for meeting me, especially on such short notice." "Well, when someone's threatening to take your home over alleged dues from the Clinton administration, I'd call that an emergency," she said with a wry smile, immediately putting Thomas more at ease. Thomas passed her the HOA letter and a folder containing his weekend discoveries. Samantha reviewed the documents methodically, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad. Her face revealed nothing, but Thomas noticed how she lingered on certain pages, her brow furrowing. "Mr. Jenkins, when did Oak Ridge switch to this new management company?" "About 6 months ago. There was very little communication about it, just a notice that Strategic Community Management Solutions would be taking over." "And the board members, how long have they served?" Thomas considered this. Victoria Harmon became president in January. "The others?" "I believe the longest-serving member has been there about 5 years." Samantha nodded, jotting something down. "So no institutional memory of those early disputes." She flipped through more pages, then suddenly stopped, her eyes widening slightly. She pulled out the HOA's governing documents, copies Thomas had received when purchasing the home, and turned to a section Thomas hadn't examined. "Mr. Jenkins," she said slowly, "are you aware that your HOA's own bylaws contain a limitations clause on collections?" Thomas leaned forward. "What do you mean?" She turned the document around, pointing to a paragraph on a page with yellowed edges. "Right here, Section 8.4. Any assessment not collected within 7 years of its due date shall be considered permanently waived and uncollectible." Thomas stared at the words, his heart beginning to race. "So they can't collect anything before 2018. "Potentially. And there's more." She pulled out her tablet and quickly navigated to a legal reference site. "California has a statute of limitations on debt collection, typically 4 years for written contracts. HOAs sometimes argue they're exempt under certain circumstances, but there's strong precedent establishing limits to how far back they can go." For the first time since receiving the letter, Thomas felt a flicker of hope. "What should I do next?" Samantha closed her portfolio decisively. "I'm a paralegal, not an attorney, so I can't represent you formally. But I know someone who can help. Harold Winters. He's technically retired but consults on cases like yours. He loves taking on HOAs that overstep." She smiled, a hint of mischief in her eyes. "How does Wednesday sound?" Harold Winters' home office reflected its owner, dignified, slightly cluttered, but radiating wisdom acquired over decades of legal practice. Leather-bound law volumes lined built-in bookshelves, and framed newspaper clippings documented victories against entities that had underestimated the now 72-year-old attorney. "Statute of limitations," Harold mused, pushing his wire-rimmed glasses up his nose as he examined the documents spread across his mahogany desk. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the bay window as Thomas and Samantha sat across from him. "It's the first thing any competent collections attorney should check." Harold had the deliberate speech pattern of someone who'd spent a lifetime choosing his words carefully. His silver hair and bow tie gave him an air of distinguished eccentricity. "The 7-year provision in your HOA's bylaws is unusual, and unusually beneficial to you," he continued. "Most associations update these documents to maximize their collection powers. Yours hasn't been revised since 1992, which explains why this favorable provision remains." Thomas leaned forward. "So they can't collect anything older than 7 years." "That's the starting point," Harold nodded. "But it gets better. I've reviewed the special assessment documentation from 1997, and it's fatally flawed. According to your HOA's own procedures, Special assessments exceeding $1,000 required a 2/3 membership vote, which never occurred. The board attempted to implement it unilaterally. They rescinded it after complaints, Thomas added. Exactly, Harold tapped the document. But apparently they never properly closed it in their accounting system. When this new management company migrated old records, they likely found this outstanding assessment and included it illegally in your alleged debt. Samantha, who had been taking notes, looked up. What about the gaps during management transitions? Harold's expression darkened. Troubling pattern. They have the burden of proving non-payment. Your bank records showing the withdrawals create a rebuttable presumption that payments were made. He turned to his computer, typing rapidly despite his age. The printer hummed to life, producing several pages which Harold gathered and passed to Thomas. These are 3 California cases specifically addressing HOA collection limitations. Particularly relevant is Harbor Vista HOA Rodriguez, which established that the statute of limitations cannot be reset simply by carrying old debts forward on new ledgers, a practice called debt rolling that some unscrupulous associations attempt. Thomas scanned the cases, understanding little of the legal terminology, but grasping the significance of the outcomes. So what do we do? He asked. Harold smiled, the kind of smile that had likely preceded many courtroom victories. First, we craft a response that educates them about their legal overreach. Then, you exercise your right to a hearing before the board. Associations hate public confrontations about their mistakes, especially when those mistakes could affect multiple homeowners. Thomas felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. Do you think they'll back down? They'll have no choice, Harold said confidently. But first, let's review everything one more time. Details matter in these cases. For the next 2 hours, they meticulously assembled Thomas's defense, building an ironclad case against the HOA's demands. With each document organized and each argument refined, Thomas's anxiety transformed into something he hadn't expected: righteous indignation. Thomas's dining room had become a war room. For 2 weeks, he worked alongside Samantha and occasionally Harold to prepare for the HOA hearing. The table disappeared beneath stacks of documents, legal reference books, and takeout containers from the local Chinese restaurant. We need to understand our opponents, Harold advised, guiding their strategy. I've researched your board members and this management company. Samantha pinned profiles of each board member to Thomas's corkboard. Victoria Harmon, she began, pointing to a photo of a stern-looking woman in her 50s, real estate agent, elected president in January. No legal background, but highly aggressive about property values. Michael Chen, she continued, indicating a younger man, software engineer, 2 years on the board, handles the HOA website and electronic communications. Diana Wilson, retired school principal, 3 years on the board, generally votes with the majority. Robert Sanderson, financial advisor, 5 years on the board, the longest serving member. And finally, Gabriela Morales, newest member, joined in March, works in marketing. Harold nodded approvingly. And what about strategic community management solutions? Samantha flipped to another page in her portfolio. Founded 8 years ago by Jeremy Phelps, former real estate developer, the company manages 23 HOA communities in the county. They've been sued twice for aggressive collection practices. Both cases settled out of court, Harold added, which tells me they retreat when seriously challenged. Thomas absorbed this information, seeing the human elements behind the threatening letter. What do you think motivated them to dig back to 1997? Harold and Samantha exchanged glances. Commission, they said simultaneously. Management companies typically receive a percentage of recovered funds, Harold explained. Finding old debts to collect is highly profitable, especially when homeowners don't fight back. Thomas felt his resolve strengthening. This wasn't just about his $47,000 anymore. It was about justice. Now, Harold said, shifting topics, let's rehearse your presentation. You'll have 15 minutes according to the bylaws. Thomas practiced his statement multiple times, refining it with each iteration. Harold coached him on maintaining composure, speaking clearly, and emphasizing key points without appearing hostile. The night before the hearing, Thomas couldn't sleep. He paced his living room at 2 a.m., rehearsing arguments in his head. On impulse, he dialed Eleanor. "I'm terrified, Ellie," he admitted when she answered, groggy from sleep. "That's normal," she reassured him. "But remember, you're not just fighting for yourself. After you called me, I talked to other neighbors. At least 3 others received similar letters, not as high as yours, but still thousands of dollars." Thomas hadn't known this. Why didn't they say anything? Shame, maybe, or they're just paying it because they're scared. Margaret Wilson is taking out a home equity loan to pay the $18,000 they're demanding from her. Thomas's hands tightened around the phone. That's outrageous. Exactly. So tomorrow, you're speaking for everyone who's been intimidated. You need to sleep, Thomas. Tomorrow will take care of itself. Somehow, knowing others were affected strengthened Thomas's resolve. When he finally slept, it was with determination rather than fear. The Oak Ridge Estates Community Center buzzed with unusual energy for a Tuesday evening board meeting. Word had spread about Thomas's challenge, drawing 3 times the normal attendance. Neighbors who typically avoided HOA meetings filled the rows of folding chairs, creating a low murmur of anticipation. Thomas sat in the front row, Harold and Samantha flanking him like generals preparing for battle. His folder of documents lay precisely arranged on his lap, color-coded tabs marking key exhibits. Despite his outward composure, his heart hammered against his ribs. At exactly 7:00 p.m., Victoria Harmon called the meeting to order, her gavel striking with unnecessary force. The board members sat elevated on a small platform behind a curved table, name placards identifying each one. Jeremy Phelps from the management company sat slightly apart, his expression impassive behind stylish glasses. Beside him sat a young man in an expensive suit who was introduced as Andrew Carlisle, the HOA's attorney. Standard agenda items proceeded with mechanical efficiency until they reached homeowner forum. Victoria's voice noticeably cooled as she announced, "Mr. Thomas Jenkins has requested a special hearing regarding his account status. You have 15 minutes, Mr. Jenkins." Thomas approached the podium with measured steps, Harold and Samantha moving to stand supportively behind him. He arranged his documents, took a deep breath, and surveyed the room before speaking. "Thank you, Madam President, board members, neighbors." His voice emerged steadier than he expected. 3 weeks ago, I received a letter claiming I owed this association $47,382.16 dating back to 1997. Today, I will demonstrate why this claim is not only inaccurate but legally unenforceable. Victoria shifted uncomfortably as Thomas methodically presented his case. He started with the statute of limitations under California law, then highlighted the HOA's own 7-year limitation clause, projecting the bylaw onto the screen behind the board. Several board members turned to look at the projection, clearly seeing this information for the first time. Furthermore, Thomas continued, his confidence growing, the special assessment from 1997, which comprises over $14,000 of my alleged debt when late fees and interest are included, was never properly enacted according to the procedures specified in these same bylaws. He proceeded to show the documentation of the rescinded assessment, then displayed his bank records showing consistent HOA payments alongside the gaps in the HOA's acknowledgement of those payments. In summary, Thomas concluded as his 15 minutes neared their end. The majority of this alleged debt is legally uncollectible due to both state law and this association's own governing documents. The remainder represents payments already made but not properly credited during management transitions. The room had grown utterly silent. Thomas could feel the collective gaze of his neighbors, some sympathetic, others calculating whether this affected their own situations. Victoria cleared her throat. "Mr. Carlisle, would you like to respond?" The young attorney rose, straightening his tie. While Mr. Jenkins presents an interesting interpretation, the statute of limitations is refreshed each month and assessment goes unpaid. Furthermore, the special assessment from 1997 was properly documented in association records. Harold stepped forward. May I address the board as Mr. Jenkins' advisor?" Victoria hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. Her role approached with the confidence of decades in courtrooms. Mr. Carlisle cites a minority view that has been repeatedly rejected by California courts. I direct the board's attention to Harbor Vista HOA Rodriguez, which explicitly prohibits the debt rolling practice he describes. Harold distributed copies of the case to each board member. Additionally, your own governing documents, which supersede general practices when more restrictive, explicitly state a 7-year limitation with no provision for refreshing or rolling debt forward. The attorney flushed, clearly unfamiliar with the case Harold cited. He whispered urgently to Jeremy Phelps, whose expression had grown increasingly concerned. From the audience, an elderly woman stood. "I received a similar letter claiming I owed $18,000. Does this apply to my case too?" Before Victoria could prevent it, another resident stood. "I got one for $12,600. Victoria banged her gavel. "Please, this is Mr. Jenkins' hearing only. Other matters must be scheduled separately." Robert Sanderson, the longest-serving board member, leaned forward. "Victoria, I think we should discuss this in executive session." The board members huddled in whispered conversation while the room waited in tense silence. Finally, Victoria addressed the attendees. "The board will take a 15-minute recess to consult with counsel. Please remain seated." As the board and their attorney retreated to a side room, the community center erupted in conversation. Several homeowners approached Thomas, sharing similar letters they'd received. Eleanor arrived, slightly late, and gave Thomas an encouraging thumb up from the back of the room. Thomas felt a curious mixture of anxiety and vindication. He'd stood his ground. Now it remained to be seen if the HOA would recognize their overreach. When the board members returned 15 minutes later, the change in their demeanor was striking. Victoria's earlier confidence had evaporated, replaced by a tight-lipped professionalism that barely concealed her discomfort. Jeremy Phelps from the management company had loosened his tie and was continuously checking his phone, avoiding eye contact with anyone in the room. Only their attorney maintained his composure, though his earlier certainty had given way to a more measured expression. Victoria called the meeting back to order. After consultation with counsel, the board has reached a decision regarding Mr. Jenkins' account. She paused, seeming to struggle with what came next. Based on the association's governing documents and applicable state law, the board has voted to rescind all collection attempts for assessments older than 7 years. A collective murmur rippled through the audience. Thomas exchanged a quick glance with Harold, who gave an almost imperceptible nod of approval. Additionally, Victoria continued, her voice strained, "The board will initiate a comprehensive audit of all accounts to ensure that payments have been properly credited, particularly during management company transitions." Robert Sanderson leaned forward, taking over as Victoria seemed reluctant to continue. "We will also be reviewing the special assessment from 1997 to determine its validity under our governing documents. Any homeowner who has received a collection notice relating to assessments older than 7 years should contact the management office to have their account reviewed." The attorney whispered something to Victoria, who nodded and addressed the room again. "The board apologizes for any confusion this may have caused to our residents. We strive to maintain the community's financial health while acting in accordance with all legal requirements." Thomas recognized the carefully worded non-apology for what it was, an attempt to save face while retreating from an indefensible position. Still, it represented victory. After the meeting adjourned, Jeremy Phelps approached Thomas, Harold, and Samantha in the parking lot. His earlier arrogance had vanished. "Mr. Jenkins," he began awkwardly, "I want to personally assure you that we'll be adjusting your account immediately. There's no need for further escalation." Harold stepped slightly forward. "We'll expect written confirmation that Mr. Jenkins' account has been cleared, with all alleged debts permanently removed from his ledger. Additionally, any negative credit reporting related to this matter should be retracted immediately." Phelps nodded quickly. "Of course, we'll have that to you by the end of the week." As Phelps walked away, Thomas turned to Harold and Samantha. Is it really over? Almost, Harold said. Once we receive their written confirmation, I'd say you're in the clear. They know they're vulnerable not just to dismissal of their claims, but potentially to a countersuit for improper debt collection practices. Neighbors approached to congratulate Thomas, many asking for Harold's contact information. The night air carried a sense of communal victory as Thomas finally headed home, exhausted but triumphant. The next morning, Thomas received an email from Robert Sanderson, sent from his personal account rather than his HOA address. "What you did took courage," the message read. The management company presented these collection opportunities as found money for the association. None of us questioned the legality, and we should have. Changes are coming. By spring, Oak Ridge Estates had transformed. The confrontation had catalyzed a community-wide awakening about homeowner rights and board responsibilities. Thomas found himself at the center of this quiet revolution, though he'd never sought the spotlight. 3 months after the hearing, the HOA hosted an educational workshop in the community center. Thomas stood at the podium, not as an accused debtor this time, but as a presenter alongside Samantha, who had volunteered her expertise pro bono. "Knowledge is your strongest defense," Thomas told his neighbors as they filled every seat in the room. "Understanding your governing documents isn't just for board members. It's every homeowner's responsibility." Samantha had prepared an accessible guide to HOA laws and homeowner rights, which was distributed to every household. The board had undergone significant changes, too. Victoria Harmon had resigned in February, citing personal reasons, but widely understood to be a response to the collection fiasco. Strategic Community Management Solutions had been replaced with a more homeowner-friendly company after their contract expired. The most significant change, however, was the level of participation. HOA meetings that once struggled to reach quorum now had waiting lists for seating. Committees that had operated with minimal oversight now included vigilant homeowners ensuring transparency. Robert Sanderson, who had emerged as an unexpected ally, had been elected the new president. Under his leadership, the board had updated the community's governing documents for the first time in 30 years, maintaining the 7-year collection limitation, but clarifying other provisions that had caused confusion. Thomas declined numerous suggestions that he run for the board, instead establishing an informal homeowner advocacy group that met monthly in his living room. Eleanor served as his co-chair, her organizational skills complementing his growing knowledge of HOA regulations. The audit initiated after Thomas's hearing discovered numerous accounting errors affecting dozens of homeowners. Margaret Wilson, who had nearly taken out a home equity loan to pay her alleged debt, received a full retraction and apology. In several cases, the association even discovered overpayments that were refunded to residents. One evening in June, Thomas hosted a backyard barbecue for those who had supported him through the ordeal. Harold grilled steaks while Samantha mixed drinks and Eleanor arranged food on the patio table. Neighbors stopped by throughout the evening, many bringing dishes to share in the impromptu community celebration. As twilight settled over the gathering, Harold raised his glass in a toast. "To Thomas," he said, "who reminded us all that sometimes the little guy wins." Thomas smiled, feeling a warmth that went beyond the summer evening. He thought of Martha and how proud she would have been. The house they had shared for so many years remained their legacy, now unthreatened. "I never wanted to be an activist," he told his friends as they sat around the fire pit later that night. "I just wanted to be left alone in my home." "Sometimes leadership finds you when you're not looking for it," Eleanor replied, patting his hand. "You stood up when others couldn't or wouldn't." Thomas gazed around at the community that had become something more than a collection of houses. It had become a true neighborhood. The threatening letter that had arrived last autumn had set in motion changes none of them could have anticipated. What had begun as one man's defense against an unjust debt had evolved into a community reclaiming its voice. As his neighbors laughed and shared stories under the stars, Thomas felt a profound sense of belonging. The HOA battle had taken him through fear and uncertainty, but led to something unexpected: a stronger community and his own renewed purpose. For a man who had worried his best days were behind him, it was a surprisingly hopeful new chapter. The next morning, Thomas woke to find an envelope slipped under his front door. Inside was a handwritten note signed by dozens of his neighbors. "Thank you for fighting for all of us," it read simply. Thomas pinned it to his refrigerator right next to Martha's recipe for apple pie, two reminders of what truly made a house a home.